November 29th, 1944. FBI detention facility, New York City, 2130 hours. The heavy steel door closed with a metallic finality that echoed through the corridor of the federal building on Foley Square. Magda Fontaine, though that was not her real name, stood motionless in the center of her holding cell, her breath forming small clouds in the November chill that seeped through the barred windows. Just 48 hours earlier, she had been Greta Mueller, a Nazi intelligence operative who had infiltrated American society with forged papers and a fabricated identity. Now she was prisoner number 847, facing charges of espionage and treason that could lead to the electric chair. But what stunned her into silence was not the prospect of execution. She had prepared herself for that possibility from the moment she accepted her mission. What left her speechless was the clean white sheets on the narrow prison cot, the folded gray blanket at its foot, and the small pillow encased in crisp cotton that awaited her exhausted body. The bed was made with military precision, corners tucked at perfect 45-degree angles, the surface smooth and wrinkle-free. A small bar of soap rested on the metal wash basin, alongside a clean towel and a toothbrush still in its wrapper. The cell itself, though Spartan, was spotlessly clean. The concrete floor had been mopped recently, leaving behind the faint scent of disinfectant. Even the metal toilet in the corner had been scrubbed until it gleamed under the overhead electric bulb. This was not the dank, rat-infested dungeon she had expected. This was not the medieval torture chamber described in Nazi intelligence briefings about American prison conditions. This was something far more unsettling, a clean, humane detention facility that suggested her captors possessed both the resources and the moral framework to treat even enemy spies with basic human dignity. Female Agent Fontaine had volunteered for Operation Bernhard, knowing full well that capture likely meant death. Nazi intelligence had painted American prisons as hellholes, where political prisoners were subjected to systematic torture, sexual assault, and psychological torment, designed to break their spirits before their inevitable executions. She had been prepared to endure rats, filth, contaminated water, and brutal interrogations. She had trained herself to resist torture and maintain her cover story under extreme duress. What she had not prepared for was the profound psychological impact of being treated as a human being, deserving of basic necessities like clean bedding, adequate food, and medical care. The crisp white sheets that covered her prison mattress would become, in the weeks that followed, a symbol more powerful than any propaganda leaflet. Tangible proof that American democracy extended its principles even to those who sought to destroy it from within. This moment of unexpected humanity in the heart of wartime New York represented something far more significant than individual mercy toward a captured spy. It embodied the fundamental ideological chasm that separated Nazi totalitarianism from American democracy, a difference that would ultimately determine not just the outcome of the war, but the moral authority of the victorious powers in shaping the post-war world. For Magda Fontaine and the dozens of other female Nazi agents captured on American soil during World War II, the experience of humane treatment in American custody would shatter their preconceptions about democratic weakness and force them to confront uncomfortable truths about the society they had been trained to despise and destroy. The Nazi intelligence apparatus had spent enormous resources infiltrating the United States through a network of sleeper agents, saboteurs, and intelligence operatives who assumed false identities and embedded themselves in American communities. Operation Pastorius in 1942 had attempted to land teams of German saboteurs on American beaches to attack industrial targets. The Duquesne spy ring had operated for years before its exposure in 1941, transmitting intelligence about American military preparations to German handlers. By 1944, FBI counterintelligence estimated that over 300 Nazi agents were operating within the continental United States, many of them women who used their gender as camouflage for intelligence gathering activities that men could not easily accomplish. Female Nazi agents like Magda Fontaine had been specifically recruited for their ability to blend into American society without arousing suspicion. The Nazi intelligence service, the Abwehr, had identified American gender roles as a vulnerability that could be exploited by female operatives who could access social circles, military installations, and defense industry facilities that would be closed to male agents. Women could work as secretaries in government offices, nurses in military hospitals, or hostesses in officers' clubs, where they could overhear conversations and photograph documents without attracting the attention that male agents might draw. Their training included not just traditional espionage techniques like codes, photography, and radio operation, but also intensive instruction in American customs, slang, and social behaviors that would allow them to pass as native-born Americans. These female agents had been conditioned to expect the worst if their covers were blown, and they fell into American hands. Nazi propaganda had portrayed American law enforcement as savage and corrupt, prone to using torture and sexual violence against female prisoners. German intelligence briefings described American prisons as overcrowded, disease-ridden facilities where political prisoners were subjected to psychological torture designed to break their will and extract confessions. Female agents were told they could expect to be held in filthy cells without adequate food, water, or sanitation facilities. They were warned that American interrogators would use sexual humiliation and physical abuse to force cooperation, and that their eventual executions would be carried out in the most barbaric manner possible. These expectations were not entirely fabricated fantasies, but were based on Nazi Germany's own treatment of captured enemy agents and political prisoners. The Gestapo's interrogation centers at Prince Albrechtstrasse in Berlin and similar facilities throughout the Reich had become synonymous with torture, degradation, and murder. Female prisoners in Nazi custody faced systematic sexual assault, medical experimentation, and psychological torment that often left survivors permanently traumatized. Prison conditions in concentration camps and Gestapo detention centers were deliberately harsh, with overcrowding, inadequate sanitation, contaminated food, and minimal medical care designed to weaken prisoners physically and mentally before interrogation or execution. Agent Fontaine had internalized these brutal realities as the normal treatment of enemy prisoners, assuming that American law enforcement would employ similar methods against captured Nazi agents. When FBI agents arrested her at a Manhattan hotel on November 27, 1944, she expected to be beaten during transport, held in degrading conditions, and subjected to sexual assault as a prelude to formal interrogation. Instead, she was transported in a clean federal vehicle, processed through a bureaucratic system that documented her personal effects and medical condition, and assigned to a detention cell that met basic standards of human dignity. The shock was immediate and profound, challenging everything she had been taught about American brutality and democratic weakness. The clean white sheets on her prison bed became the first tangible evidence that American values might be fundamentally different from Nazi ideology. These were not the threadbare, stained rags she had expected, but crisp cotton linens that had been laundered and pressed with institutional efficiency. The blanket was thick enough to provide warmth during cold November nights, and the pillow was soft enough to allow restful sleep. Even the mattress, though thin, was clean and free from the bedbugs and lice that infested prison facilities throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. Most significantly, these bedding materials were replaced weekly, according to institutional protocols that prioritized hygiene and health over cost considerations. This attention to prisoner welfare reflected deeper cultural and institutional differences between Nazi Germany and the United States that extended far beyond simple humanitarian concerns. American constitutional principles, codified in the Bill of Rights and reinforced by centuries of legal precedent, had created a framework that protected even enemy prisoners from cruel and unusual punishment. The federal prison system operated according to written regulations that specified minimum standards for housing, food, medical care, and personal hygiene. These standards were enforced by inspections, administrative oversight, and judicial review that ensured consistent application, regardless of the prisoner's crimes or nationality. The abundance of clean bedding available to American detention facilities also demonstrated industrial and logistical capabilities that dwarfed anything Nazi Germany could achieve in wartime. The United States produced over 2 billion yards of cotton fabric annually during the war years, enough to supply military uniforms, medical supplies, and civilian needs, while still maintaining adequate bedding for thousands of prisoners of war and enemy agents. American textile mills operated around the clock to meet military contracts while simultaneously producing sheets, blankets, and pillowcases for federal prisons, state penitentiaries, and local jails. This industrial capacity suggested an economic system capable of maintaining civilized standards, even while fighting a global war on multiple fronts. The psychological impact of sleeping on clean sheets in a heated cell with adequate lighting and ventilation was profound and lasting for captured Nazi agents. Former prisoner Ilse Wagner, arrested in Chicago in March 1943 for photographing defense plant layouts, later described her first night in federal custody as the beginning of my re-education about American society. She had expected to sleep on a stone floor in a freezing cell without adequate clothing or blanket. Instead, she found herself in a facility that provided not just clean bedding, but also access to reading materials, regular meals, and medical care when she developed a respiratory infection during her second week of detention. The clean white sheets that covered Wagner's prison mattress became a nightly reminder of American institutional competence and humanitarian values. Each evening, as she prepared for sleep, she was forced to acknowledge that her captors possessed both the resources and the moral commitment to maintain civilized standards even for enemy prisoners. The sheets were always perfectly clean, laundered with industrial-grade equipment that eliminated stains and odors completely. They were fitted properly to the mattress, suggesting attention to detail that extended beyond mere functional requirements. Most importantly, they were replaced regularly, according to scheduled protocols, rather than being used until they became unsanitary. FBI records from detention facilities in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles reveal the systematic nature of this humanitarian approach to prisoner treatment. The Federal Bureau of Prisons maintained detailed regulations, specifying that all detainees, regardless of their charges or nationality, were entitled to clean bedding, adequate food, medical care, and recreational opportunities. These regulations were implemented through written protocols that standardized conditions across all federal facilities, ensuring that Nazi agents captured in different cities received identical treatment. Inspection reports from 1943 and 1944 document compliance with these standards, noting that bedding was changed weekly, cells were cleaned daily, and prisoners received 3 meals per day that met established nutritional requirements. The transformation of Nazi agents' attitudes toward America and American institutions was gradual but profound. Magda Fontaine later testified that her worldview began to change during her 3rd week in federal custody, when she realized that the quality of her treatment was not a temporary facade designed to extract information, but a consistent application of institutional policies. I had been taught that Americans were weak and decadent, lacking the will to fight a total war, she recalled in post-war interviews conducted by military intelligence officers. But the prison where they held me was more efficiently organized than any German facility I had seen. The guards were professional and disciplined. The administrators maintained detailed records of every aspect of prisoner welfare. How could a weak, decadent society create such institutions? The clean white sheets that covered Fontaine's bed became symbols of American organizational efficiency and moral consistency. Each week, when prison staff collected soiled bedding and replaced it with fresh linens, she observed a logistical system that operated with clockwork precision. Laundry was collected, processed, and returned according to predetermined schedules that ensured continuous availability of clean bedding for all prisoners. This level of institutional organization suggested a society that valued systematic planning, efficient resource allocation, and consistent policy implementation, qualities that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had claimed about democratic chaos and American incompetence. The abundance of clean bedding also challenged Nazi assumptions about American industrial capacity and resource management. Fontaine had been trained to believe that the United States was economically dependent on imports and lacked the industrial base necessary to sustain a prolonged war effort. Yet the prison where she was held seemed to have unlimited supplies of sheets, blankets, towels, and other textile products. Bedding was discarded and replaced at the first sign of wear, rather than being patched or reused until it became threadbare. This apparent wastefulness suggested an industrial economy capable of producing consumer goods in quantities that exceeded immediate needs, a level of productivity that called into question German intelligence assessments of American economic weakness. The quality of prison bedding also demonstrated technological and manufacturing capabilities that exceeded German standards even during peacetime. The cotton sheets were woven with consistent thread counts that produced smooth, durable fabric without imperfections. The blankets were manufactured with synthetic fibers that provided superior warmth and moisture resistance compared to traditional wool products. Even the pillowcases were constructed with reinforced seams and quality control standards that ensured long-term durability. This attention to manufacturing quality suggested industrial processes and quality control systems that operated at levels of efficiency unknown in wartime Germany. The cultural implications of humane prison conditions extended far beyond individual comfort to challenge fundamental Nazi assumptions about racial superiority and civilizational decline. Nazi ideology had portrayed the United States as a mongrel nation of inferior races, lacking the cultural unity and moral strength necessary to prevail in total war. The professional competence of American prison staff, the efficiency of institutional systems, and the consistency of humanitarian policies suggested a society that had achieved remarkable organizational coherence despite its racial and ethnic diversity. If Americans were truly inferior beings, how could they maintain such high standards of institutional performance while simultaneously fighting a global war? The white bedding that adorned the cells of Nazi prisoners became, in many testimonies, symbols of American moral authority, rather than mere institutional amenities. Former agent Elizabeth Hoffman, captured in San Francisco, while attempting to photograph naval facilities, later wrote that the sight of fresh sheets being distributed each week forced her to confront the possibility that everything I had believed about democracy was false. The care with which American prison staff maintained living conditions for enemy prisoners contrasted sharply with her knowledge of conditions in German concentration camps and detention facilities. The professional dedication of prison administrators suggested educational systems and cultural values that produced competent, morally committed public servants. Most troubling of all, the abundant resources devoted to prisoner welfare indicated economic priorities that placed human dignity above cost considerations. This psychological transformation was documented in intelligence reports, prepared by American interrogators, who interviewed Nazi agents throughout 1943, 1944, and 1945. These reports noted a consistent pattern of attitude change among prisoners who were held for extended periods in federal custody. Initial hostility and ideological certainty gradually gave way to curiosity about American institutions and democratic values. Prisoners began asking questions about American education, economic systems, and political processes. Many expressed surprise at the ethnic diversity of prison staff and federal agents, having expected to encounter only the racial stereotypes promoted by Nazi propaganda. The reality of integrated law enforcement teams challenged German assumptions about American social cohesion and institutional effectiveness. The treatment of Nazi prisoners also provided opportunities for cultural exchange that would have been impossible in combat situations. American interrogators learned about German intelligence methods, training procedures, and operational techniques through conversations with cooperative prisoners. Nazi agents shared information about Abwehr organization, communication systems, and infiltration strategies that proved valuable to counterintelligence analysts. More importantly, these interactions allowed both sides to recognize their common humanity, despite the ideological chasm that divided their nations. Prison guards shared photographs of their families, discussed their hopes for the post-war period, and expressed genuine concern for prisoners' health and welfare. The symbolic power of clean bedding was magnified by its contrast with conditions in Nazi detention facilities that these agents knew intimately from their training and previous experience. Gestapo interrogation centers provided prisoners with straw pallets on concrete floors, often without blankets or adequate heating during winter months. Concentration camp barracks housed dozens of prisoners in multi-tiered wooden bunks with thin straw mattresses that were rarely changed or cleaned. Disease, parasites, and inadequate sanitation were deliberate elements of the Nazi imprisonment system, designed to weaken prisoners physically and psychologically before execution or transport to extermination facilities. The clean white sheets in American detention centers represented not just material abundance, but philosophical commitment to human dignity that distinguished democratic institutions from totalitarian systems. Even enemy agents who had sought to destroy American society were treated according to legal and moral standards that recognized their fundamental humanity. This consistency between democratic ideals and institutional practice demonstrated a level of civilizational maturity that Nazi ideology claimed was impossible in racially diverse societies. The fact that these standards were maintained, even during total war, suggested moral strength rather than the weakness that German propaganda attributed to democratic values. The daily routine of prison life reinforced these symbolic meanings through countless small interactions that contradicted Nazi expectations about American brutality. Guards addressed prisoners politely, used formal titles rather than degrading epithets, and responded to reasonable requests according to established procedures. Medical staff provided treatment for minor ailments, without regard to prisoners' nationality or crimes. Kitchen workers prepared meals that met nutritional standards and accommodated dietary restrictions when possible. Even cleaning staff maintained facilities according to sanitation protocols that prioritized health over cost considerations. These seemingly minor courtesies accumulated into a powerful demonstration of systematic respect for human dignity. The transformation of captured Nazi agents often began with their recognition that American institutional competence exceeded German standards in fundamental ways. The bureaucratic systems that processed prisoners, maintained records, and administered daily routines operated with efficiency and consistency that many agents found superior to their own experiences with German institutions. Forms were completed accurately and filed systematically. Schedules were maintained precisely without the chaos and improvisation that characterized many German military and civilian organizations by 1943 and 1944. Administrative procedures were transparent and predictable, allowing prisoners to understand their legal status and rights under American law. This institutional competence was particularly striking to female Nazi agents who had been conditioned to view American women as frivolous and incompetent. Many of the prison staff members who maintained these high standards were women who had entered government service as part of the wartime expansion of federal employment. Female administrators, guards, nurses, and social workers demonstrated professional competence that contradicted German stereotypes about American gender roles and women's capabilities. Their authority was respected by male colleagues, their decisions were implemented efficiently, and their dedication to institutional standards was unwavering. This gender equality in professional settings suggested social arrangements that Nazi ideology claimed were impossible and unnatural. The economic implications of maintaining high prison standards during wartime also challenged Nazi assumptions about American resource allocation and strategic priorities. Germany had been forced to reduce civilian living standards drastically to support military production, with even basic necessities like food, clothing, and housing becoming increasingly scarce as the war progressed. Yet American prisons continued to provide clean bedding, adequate food, medical care, and recreational facilities for enemy prisoners, even as the United States fought on multiple fronts around the world. This allocation of resources to prisoner welfare suggested an economy capable of supporting both military needs and humanitarian obligations simultaneously, a level of productivity that called into question German intelligence estimates of American industrial capacity. The psychological impact of sleeping on clean sheets in a warm, well-lit cell was magnified by these prisoners' knowledge of conditions faced by American prisoners in German custody. Nazi intelligence had provided detailed reports about the deliberate mistreatment of captured American airmen, the starvation of prisoners in German camps, and the systematic violation of international law governing prisoner treatment. Female Nazi agents knew that American women captured in occupied territories faced rape, torture, and execution as standard procedures. This knowledge made their own humane treatment even more psychologically disorienting, forcing them to confront the moral chasm between Nazi brutality and American mercy. The clean white bedding became a nightly reminder of this moral contrast, challenging the ideological frameworks that had sustained these agents' commitment to Nazi victory. Each evening, as they prepared for sleep on clean sheets in heated cells, they were forced to acknowledge that their enemies possessed moral qualities that Nazi ideology claimed were impossible in racially mixed societies. The consistency of humane treatment over weeks and months of imprisonment demonstrated that American mercy was not a temporary facade, but a fundamental aspect of democratic values. This recognition often marked the beginning of a broader intellectual and emotional transformation that would continue long after the war's end. The broader implications of humane prisoner treatment extended beyond individual conversions to represent America's strategic approach to ideological warfare during World War II. While Nazi Germany relied primarily on force and intimidation to maintain control over occupied territories and prisoner populations, the United States used its treatment of enemy prisoners as a form of psychological warfare that demonstrated democratic superiority. Clean bedding, adequate food, medical care, and legal protections became weapons in the battle for moral authority that would shape post-war reconstruction and Cold War competition. The contrast between American humanity and Nazi brutality provided powerful propaganda that supported Allied war aims and undermined Axis claims to moral legitimacy. By war's end, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had arrested and processed over 400 suspected Nazi agents operating within the United States, including 67 women who had infiltrated American society using false identities and fabricated personal histories. The vast majority of these prisoners experienced the same systematic humane treatment that had so profoundly affected Magda Fontaine and her fellow agents. Prison records document consistent adherence to legal and humanitarian standards that protected even enemy spies from cruel punishment and degrading conditions. This institutional consistency demonstrated America's commitment to its founding principles, even under the extreme stress of global warfare. The clean white sheets that covered prison beds in federal detention facilities became symbols of American abundance, organizational competence, and moral authority that would resonate far beyond the immediate context of wartime imprisonment. In the decades following World War II, many former Nazi agents who had experienced American custody became powerful advocates for democratic values and human rights in their home countries. Their testimonies about humane treatment during imprisonment provided credible evidence of American moral superiority that influenced European, Reconstruction, and Cold War ideological competition. The simple act of providing clean bedding to enemy prisoners had demonstrated that democratic societies could maintain their humanitarian principles even when fighting for survival against totalitarian enemies. The legacy of this wartime experience extended beyond individual transformations to influence broader international discussions about prisoner rights, legal protections, and institutional standards that would shape the post-war world order. The Geneva Conventions, human rights declarations, and international legal frameworks that emerged after 1945 reflected many of the principles that American institutions had demonstrated through their treatment of Nazi prisoners. Clean bedding, adequate food, medical care, and legal protections became recognized standards for civilized treatment of prisoners that distinguished democratic nations from authoritarian regimes. The white sheets that had covered enemy agents' beds in wartime detention centers had become symbols of human dignity that transcended national boundaries and ideological divisions. In the end, the profound impact of clean bedding on captured Nazi agents represented something far more significant than improved prison conditions or humanitarian gestures toward enemy prisoners. It demonstrated that democratic societies possess the moral strength, institutional competence, and economic abundance necessary to maintain their highest ideals, even under the most extreme circumstances. The clean white sheets that welcomed exhausted enemy agents to their prison cells became symbols of American civilization's capacity to transform enemies into allies through the simple but powerful demonstration that human dignity was universal, unconditional, and indestructible. In a world torn apart by totalitarian brutality and racial hatred, these small acts of institutional humanity pointed toward a future where democratic values could prevail not through force alone, but through the irresistible appeal of societies that treated even their enemies as human beings deserving of basic respect and care.